we've got all sorts of concerns, have we not, about sustainability. And it's been thrown into sharp relief by what seems to be happening to farming and farmers all over the world. That way of life seems to be under some kind of attack from governments all across the Western world, Europe, to some extent here in Britain and in North America as well. You see it in the news reports that come out of the Netherlands and have been coming out of the Netherlands for months now, where farmers have been told that they're producing too much nitrogen. There's keeping livestock and using fertilizer on the ground, they are being told, is emitting too much nitrogen, and the allegation is that nitrogen is bad for the environment. And you know, the Netherlands, Holland, they're amongst the most productive farmers on the planet. You know, they export over $100 billion worth of meat and dairy products annually. I think they're the second biggest exporter of food, certainly given the size of the place. It's a relatively small population, and yet the government is after them to stop using the fertilizers and to reduce the herds of cattle in particular by as much as a third, maybe even as much as a half. And the farmers have been protesting about that for understandable reasons. And it does seem incomprehensible. We're also being told at the same time that there's global food insecurity. So why, if there's global food insecurity, would you contemplate messing with food production? Doesn't seem to make any sense. And the farmers of the Netherlands are amongst the most innovative and the most skilled of all farmers anywhere. You know, inside their heads and in their hands, they have the answers to questions about how best and how most efficiently and effectively to produce food, crops and livestock, and yet they're being put under pressure. And the belief amongst those who are opposing the move is that the central government simply wants to drive farmers off the land so that they, being the government, can acquire the land for some other purpose, not food production. And it's not just in the Netherlands. The pressure that farmers are being put under, it's all over the developed world. It's all over Europe. Farmers are protesting all over, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, and elsewhere. The farmers are being put under pressure by their governments for all sorts of reasons, and they're pushing back. And it's not being properly or comprehensively reported by the mainstream media, but those protests are large scale, they're determined, and people are digging in. I mean, it's got to ridiculous lengths. A 16-year-old boy in a tractor at one of the protests in the Netherlands was fired on by the police. Live ammunition, bullets were fired at his tractor. 16-year-old boy. It all seems completely out of proportion and incomprehensible. So, what's going on? There's another story that's circulating widely, and it's about an Amish farmer in Pennsylvania, in North America. He's called Amos Miller, and he has an organic farm at a place in Pennsylvania called Bird in Hand. It seems to have acquired that name. I might as well explain it. In the 18th century, I think there were surveyors coming through looking at the roads, and the two of them were deciding whether they would stay where they were for the night or move on to the next bigger town. And one of them apparently said, well, a bird in the hand's worth two in the bush, i.e., just keep hold of what you've got rather than move on in the expectation of finding anything better. So anyway, Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, Amos Miller. And he's Amish, Pennsylvania Dutch, so he's of that fascinating population, that the focus was turned on it by the Harrison Ford film Witness was that the 90s, I think it was. Time stopped for the Amish in the 1800s, let's say. So they live a kind of a horse-drawn life. They don't make much use of modern energy, if at all. They travel about in buggies, horse carts, and they grow in what we would consider to be old-fashioned, they would say traditional methods. They would say the way that God intended, actually. It's a very religious community, the Amish. Closely related to the Mennonites, which is another religious sect. So there's Mennonites and Amish in populating farmland, and all in the same area around in Pennsylvania. And Amos Miller, for years now, has been under pressure from federal government. It's an interesting story. It's to the fore at the moment, and some people are saying it's a kind of very recent aggression being shown to him, as though it started under the Biden administration. But when you read around the subject, it looks as though he's been under pressure from before, right back as far as at least 2016. So, under the time of, say, the President Trump administration, he slaughters his own animals, which is pretty controversial. Most meat in the US and here it's slaughtered in kind of government approved slaughterhouses, but he slaughters his own beasts and he sells his meat products, and he does it. He has evolved a system whereby he's got a club. It's not like people turn up at a farm shop, just general members of the public, and buy. You have to join his club, and you can sort of subscribe to his products. It's in this way that he seems to have navigated a path for himself through a lot of the government regulations around the production and sale of meat and other products and dairy. He was, a few years ago, there were a couple of people became ill with listeria, and one of them died. I don't know the ins and outs of exactly what happened, but that was connected by the federal investigation to his farm, because he sells raw milk, which is, I think he's got buffalo. He's producing milk and it's unpasteurized, and that's a controversial product. I think you can buy and drink raw milk here, but I think you've got to be aware at the very least that it does come with maybe some health risks that pasteurized milk doesn't. So anyway, he's been under pressure for years. He's under pressure now. He's been stopped. It's basically reached the point where he's been fined $250,000. All of his products have been inventoried by the feds, so that they know exactly what he's got, and they've kind of pulled him to a halt. He has to pay fines. I think he's in territory where if he doesn't pay fines, he could be looking at imprisonment. And some sections of media in North America are portraying this as an attack on the Amish, and saying that it's a canary in the coal mine, that this is the federal government coming after farming, full stop, and trying to shut down anybody that's in any way independent, anyone that isn't under the bigger umbrella of the state and the bigger umbrella of the agricultural industry and all its regulations. Now, read into it for yourself if you're interested. I don't claim to be able to be judge and jury on exactly what Amos Miller has or hasn't done, what he is or isn't accused of doing. But at the very least, the reaction to it, a lot of people are very angry. There's a lot of traffic on social media and in certain parts of the media in North America. People are really agitated about what's being done to Amos Miller, which is interesting in and of itself, because it suggests that there are people out there who, when the government moves in on something as fundamental as food in that way, people get triggered, to use a slightly irritating modern term. People get affected at the fundamental level, and it's interesting to wonder, I think, exactly what might be going on there. It raises fundamental issues and ideas, and think all the time about sustainability. Hold that in your head, all the way back to Rousey and Orkney. Think about how we lived as a species all over the world, at different places, different times, and found sustainable ways of being, so that people were able to be in one place generation after generation, not just for decades or hundreds of years, but for thousands of years. That idea of being in tune with and properly understanding the landscape and being intimately connected to the production of the food. That's a profound connection that people used to have, but that so many of us in the West have lost. It also, part of that high temperature that's going on around Amos Miller, and also in the agitation that's there in the Netherlands and all across farming communities all across Europe, millions of people getting increasingly agitated about government interference with farming. another of the fundamental issues that all of that raises is that it serves us well as individuals to some extent to be independent of the state. Dependence on the state, which is the alternative, is ultimately an erosion of personal responsibility. It's surely, I would say, advantageous for all of us to be as far as we can in our circumstances and with our abilities to be as independent of the state as possible. We shouldn't want everything done for us. And we shouldn't want to get to the point where everything, food, energy, medicine, our health and well-being, everything is being dictated to us, or at least directed by the state. We should, I think it's better for us, well, it's undoubtedly better for us as individuals, as creatures, as animals, to have our independence. And it's being eroded all over the place. During lockdown, across 2 years. Now, that was supposedly about the health of the people, but look at what they did during lockdown. Look at what was done to us. Gyms were closed. Sore elbow from the gym. Gyms were closed. Play parks were closed for children. Children were discouraged from going out to run about and play on the swings and the roundabouts. People were arrested for walking about outdoors, what was deemed to be too far from their homes. People sitting on park benches drinking coffee together were chased off or sent home or even arrested. And these actions were undeniably bad for people, children included, on account of the way in which measures like those eroded people's physical and mental well-being. It ought to have been, I would say, that when we were supposedly worried about a pandemic, when we were supposedly wanting people to be as healthy as possible, people should have been being encouraged to do more for themselves, to eat better, maybe to take some vitamins like vitamin D, maybe to top up on zinc, maybe and go to the gym and go swimming. Swimming pools were closed. All of those activities, all of those ways in which, without intervention from the state, we can make ourselves better physically and mentally, they ought to have been being encouraged, but they were positively discouraged, which never made sense to me at the time. And look at the consequences that we're dealing with now. Look at the backlog of unhealthy people, people with all sorts of undiagnosed conditions. But there's also all the emotional harm that's been done, all the mental harm that's been done to people by the exercise of that state power of sending people home and telling them to stay there. And so sustainability, connection to the land, taking responsibility for ourselves, having some idea about where our food comes from, where possible even producing some of it for ourselves, not being wasteful, using everything, reusing, recycling. All of these are what it ought to properly mean to be sustainable and to be doing things that are good for the planet. I would say that lockdown was seized upon by governments. People were shut indoors on the grounds of a dangerous disease. People were stopped from travelling. And the cumulative effect of it all was that people were frightened. And people have remained frightened, and they are continuing to be frightened by government propaganda. We're being frightened by one thing after another. War in Ukraine, climate crisis. Everything is about keeping people on edge and anxious, because anxious people are compliant and anxious people are on the lookout for solutions from above. If you keep people anxious and frightened, fearful about their own well-being, fearful about the well-being of their children for long enough, they will accept more and more if it comes dressed up as a solution to their problem. And so, I think about Rousey. I think about a place where people lived for 1,000 years, generation after generation. Even after cultures evolved and changed, people continued to stay in place and to live off of the land. And then I wonder about the extent to which so many of our problems are caused because of the extent to which we're hopelessly divorced from our food. We just go to supermarkets now. Or it's moved on a pace, hasn't it? People increasingly just get their food delivered to their door in plastic bags, out the back of vans from Ocado or Waitrose or Iceland or Tesco's or wherever. It's wrapped in plastic, it's wrapped in cling film. The meat's unrecognisable. You can't tell what animal it came from, what bit of an animal it came from. We don't have a clue about how that food was grown, how those animals were raised and slaughtered. I was on years ago now, well, 5 or 6 years ago now, I was filming in Arnhem Land in Australia, and I had the opportunity to go on a crocodile hunt. I was with a man called Murrindoo Yanner, who's an Australian Aboriginal Indigenous man, an elder of his people. And he had taken Australia to court, to the highest court in the land in the end. In the 1970s, the hunting of crocodiles was banned because the saltwater crocodiles, the population was said to be imperiled by overexploitation, Crocodile Dundee and all that. So it was illegal to hunt crocodiles. But Murrindoo Yanner went to court and won back for his people, the indigenous people of Australia, the right to hunt the crocodile for food. You know, they don't hunt it to make handbags from the skin. They hunt and eat the crocodile, as their people had done for tens of thousands of years. And so I was invited to go out with them, and we went out on a boat, a little boat, an alarmingly small boat actually, on a river at night, out onto this water, black as oil. And we were holding up torches, and the beams from the torches would, suddenly the eyes of crocodiles would light up amber, pinpricks of amber light in the dark. You'd suddenly realise that there were crocodiles all over the river. And the boat, the engine would be switched off, and the boat would just drift closer and closer eventually to one of the crocodiles. And a guy on the boat with a harpoon, when it was within reach, harpooned a crocodile just behind its head. And 4 or 5 guys hauled this crocodile onto the boat. I mean, it wasn't the biggest crocodile in the world, but it was big enough. And it certainly seemed very big when it was on a small boat with all of us, with its jaws going. Long story short, the next day, or within a few hours actually, Murrindoo killed the crocodile. He cut its head off with a boning knife. And about an hour after that, we were eating of its flesh because he cooked it. Him and his people cooked it on a fire, and we ate of the crocodile. And that's the closest I've ever been to a hunt. It's the only time I've ever seen a sizable animal dispatched right before my eyes with a knife. It was silent before, during, and after its death. And it was quite something to watch, a large living creature going through the process of becoming meat to eat. I'll never forget it. And I thought then, and I think now, about how distant most of us are from the reality of turning animals into meat. And I think we need to know more about it, because you need to be in awe of the death of an animal, of that transformation from living creature into food. Because if you're not in awe of death, then you're not properly in awe of life. And that is an enervating state of being. If you're not in awe of life, you don't value it. It sounds counterintuitive that watching something die would make you more respectful of life and being alive, but I've done it, and that's what it did for me. And so I think about all of that, and I think fundamentally I feel that the solution to a lot of our problems is to pay more attention to the basics, to where we get our food, to where we live, to the landscape that we occupy ourselves, our immediate surrounds, how we can better take care of that, how we can make less of a mess. There's clearly nothing that a controlling authoritarian government fears more than an educated, healthy, strong population of self-sufficient, independent individuals who can take responsibility for themselves. On the contrary, what they want are uneducated, unhealthy, unhappy, fearful people who are made compliant by that state of mind and by that state of being. all the way back in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC, the Athenian general and historian Thucydides said, "The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools." It's incumbent upon us, as far as we possibly can, to learn as much as we can and to be as strong and healthy as we can possibly be. And all of these things come back to education, diet, and lifestyle. And we've got to take some of that back. We've got to know more about food, how to grow food, how to raise animals, how to provide some of that for ourselves. We've got to educate ourselves. We've got to better educate our children. And we've got to try and produce strong, educated, independent, healthy people that do the things that independent, strong, healthy people do. I think in those fundamentals are the answers. And I'm made to think about that, and I draw my inspiration from that, from a site like that on Rousey, where people lived for 1,000 years, paying attention to the landscape, growing the food, raising the animals. And it kept them in place and it kept them right for century after century. That's where the answers lie.